When you met Abraham Lincoln, first off, the impression you would take away was captured by someone who, in fact, had just exactly that kind of meeting. And this man said that the impression Lincoln gave you was of a rough, intelligent farmer. And he had this very thick border state accent. And, oh, Larry, he looked funny. I'm sorry, he looked homely. I mean, just no two ways about it. People would underestimate him on that basis, and he let them. He had thought his way around all of them. Despite the fact that his education was as limited as it was, here was someone who had read voraciously, who scooped things up. Contemporary literature, contemporary philosophy, especially political economy. That was his strong center.
Hello, Alan. How are you?
I am doing well, Larry. And yourself?
I'm very well. Very nice to be talking with you.
Well, I wish you were talking to a more handsome or more interesting person, but I'll do my best to keep up appearances.
Yeah, people our age, Alan, we come to understand handsomeness is overrated, but but we know some stuff.
I'm so glad to hear you say that.
Alan, I will tell our audience, is an amazing man. I'm going to ask him about this in a minute, but he studied religion, philosophy, then he turned to history. He wrote about Abraham Lincoln, beautiful book in 2003 called Redeemer President. He has a new book out called Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy and the American Experiment. And I've read the book, and I read it as a development on an application of that great book, Redeemer President. Alan, I'd like you to tell us a little, please, about your education, how you went through the stages of it, and what got you to where you are today.
I wish I could say it was because I was following a very carefully worked out plan in advance, but it wasn't. When I went to college, my first year in college was that of a music major, believe it or not. And I had great ambitions to be a serious music person and a composer. I wanted to compose. There was only one problem. I just didn't have very much talent.
Oh, darn.
You make these wonderful discoveries about yourself in college, and that's one thing I suppose that college is for. It helps you to find out what you can't do as much as what you can do. From there, I switched over to studying religious studies and was making plans to go into the ministry, went to seminary. In my last year in seminary, I was asked, would you be interested in doing some adjunct teaching in church history, which I was agreeable to. I was planning to do a master's program at the University of Pennsylvania in history anyway. So I combined the two. I ended up teaching church history for several years. An opportunity then, once I had the PhD in hand, materialized with Eastern University, and I taught there for some 15 years. And then another opportunity showed up at Gettysburg College, and I was there for another 15 years. And then yet another opportunity made itself apparent, and that was at Princeton, and I've been there since 2019. And there's at no point, Larry, that I could have ever predicted the twists and the turns that things have taken.
What'd you write your doctoral dissertation about?
On 18th century moral philosophy. And especially Jonathan Edwards and the problem of determinism and free will in American philosophy.
We've got a really great couple of Jonathan Edwards guys around here now at Hillsdale College.
Well,
I didn't know that.
Yes. Because my long suit has always been American intellectual history. I've written a lot about Lincoln. I've written a lot about the Civil War. But fundamentally, what I am at the base is I'm a historian of American ideas. And in a lot of ways, I got into doing Lincoln because of doing the history of American ideas. I had done that dissertation at Penn. It was published in 1989. And I was in the process of working on a follow-up volume to that would take the history of this idea of determinism into the 20th century. And as I worked on it, I thought it would be a nifty idea to bring Abraham Lincoln into the book, sort of a walk-on part, sort of a cameo appearance, because I knew that Lincoln had had some things to say on the subject of determinism and free will. So I wrote a paper about Lincoln and his doctrine of necessity. It was very well received, and I had an offer, an inquiry from a publisher, and lo and behold, what turned out was Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, and I've been writing about Lincoln, more or less, ever since. A little bit on the logic of the child that gets the hand in the cookie jar and can't get it out.
It, I had a great teacher. I learned of you through him, Harry Jaffa, and he's a Lincoln scholar and an Aristotle scholar and a great scholar, dead now. And I remember in class, and this is 2003, and I was long since graduated, but I happened to be in a class listening to him one day. Still lived in, I'd been back to Claremont, and he said, this book is really good. A book about Lincoln, not written by him. And I'd only heard him ever say that about Don Fehrenbacher before.
Ooh.
And I went, wow, isn't that something? And he talked about the book for an hour.
Oh, wow.
Did you know that story?
No.
Oh,
No.
yeah, no. You conquered him. And
goodness.
it's part of the reason we know each other. Because I always thought, go ahead.
I have to tell you this story about Harry Jaffa, because after writing Redeemer President, I went on to write a book about Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. And in the introduction to that book, I was responding to some questions that had been asked me about Redeemer President. A number of people assumed, oh, you must be a political science person. No, I'm sorry, I'm not. I'm a history person. Then the question was, well, then you must be a Straussian, must be a follower of Leo Strauss. And I said, well, no, I'm a history person, not a political science person. And I wrote that in the introduction to the Emancipation Proclamation book. I said, I am not a Straussian. I got a phone call in the middle of the night. Of course, this is coming from Harry, who's out on the West Coast. But I get a phone call in the middle of the night. Hello, this is Harry Jaffa. And I thought, okay, I am in trouble, probably. And he said, what do you mean to say that you're not a Straussian? I said, well, Harry, I've never read Leo Strauss. And he replied, well, you've read me. and that was supposed to settle the question.
Yeah.
I had a wonderful time with Harry. I would get calls from Harry, totally unheralded, and we would talk Lincoln. And I think almost every time I ever sat down and talked with Larry, and this was many times with Harry, he would bring the conversation back to Lincoln and the Declaration of Independence. Whatever I wanted to say about Lincoln, it had to be in connection with the Declaration of Independence.
He, in both your cases, Professor Jaffa had not had any particular interest in anything American, really. And he was charmed by the arguments of Lincoln, as were you, as was I. He discovered a copy of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in a bookstore. He didn't have enough money to buy it, he recalls. And he stood and read it. And he would go back, and he read it for hours, and he saved up and bought the book. It's the text of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And that led him to write his first book on Lincoln, Crisis of the House Divided.
I had something of a parallel experience with Harry and Crisis of the House Divided, because I first encountered Crisis of the House Divided in a secondhand copy of the book that I found at Baldwin's Book Barn in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And I took the book home with me and sat and read it, and quite frankly, sat up all night reading it. It was the first time I'd read a book which said to me that it was possible to take Abraham Lincoln seriously as a thinker, seriously as a man of ideas. I was enchanted by the book. So you might say that at that point, even years and years before I ever talked to Harry Jaffa, I had become if not a Straussian, then at least a Jaffaite.
That makes you, oddly enough, a Straussian
Oh,
because
I say, all right.
yeah, I never met Leo Strauss either. I read a lot of him. And of course, I knew Harry Jaffa. But the thing about him, I think the turning point in his life he was a very brilliant young man. He was a graduate student in Germany. He studied with the very great Martin Heidegger, who was very great, excepting for the fact that he was a Nazi.
Yeah.
And he never recanted that. Indeed, his diary's been published after his death, and we find out he was really a Nazi. And here's Leo Strauss, a Jew. And Strauss got the idea, we should start over. We should go back to the beginnings of philosophy and retrace our steps, and maybe we'll see where we went wrong. Yeah. So the heart, in my little opinion, of Strauss and of every great scholar and of Alan Guelzo is that you should take seriously what people say and write, and if they're serious people, you won't miss it.
This is true. This is very true. I mean, one of the curiosities here is that Harry, being an American boy, cast around for something that might, in the American experience, be the equivalent of the kind of classical writers whom Leo Strauss was encouraging his students to take seriously. And when Harry found that copy, that secondhand copy of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, for him, as he said afterwards, it was like finding the American equivalent of Plato's Symposium.
Yeah.
And in a sense, as Strauss encouraged his students to go back to the fountains of classical philosophy, Harry encouraged people who admired him and what he had done to go back to the fountains of American political thought. And those fountains are the Declaration of Independence and the way the Declaration is put firmly back into place by Abraham Lincoln in the experience of the Civil War.
And in that's very good. And, Professor Jaffa he fell in love with Aristotle when he was studying with Leo Strauss, and by extension also with Thomas Aquinas. And Jaffa saw in Lincoln something that is in Redeemer President and also in your new book, Ancient Faith. And that is, America is a coherent thing. It has causes. In Aristotle, there are 4 causes of things. And he thought, Lincoln sees this and he explains it to me, and I hadn't fully thought of it before, he said. Professor Jaffa became a student of Abraham Lincoln, as you have been. That's so. I think you and he have something in common. You're a frustrated musician. I'm a frustrated Major League Baseball player. I too figured out. I loved it. I was pretty good. Darn, it's not fair. These other people have talent. But then you and Professor Jaffa and we heard something great, and we heard it. Not everybody does. And that's, I wish, people always say, it's lucky that you were not a great baseball player. And I always reply, great? Lucky? Really? Wouldn't that be fun? I want you to tell us a little bit about, just describe it for us, please, Redeemer President, and then, because I want people to have that in their mind when we talk about your new book.
Redeemer President grew out of that paper I was describing, written about Lincoln and the doctrine of necessity. And it grew out of that because there was a fundamental insight that I had from doing work on that subject. And that was that Lincoln was a very serious thinker in his own right. The popular image of Lincoln is that he is a homegrown politician. He's someone from the backwoods, kind of a political Jeff Foxworthy, maybe even a little bit naive. And that's supposed to make him accessible to people. He's a person who tells jokes and funny stories, and who was able to turn a phrase in a really memorable and eloquent way, but really not terribly much more than that. That, in some respects, is one of the greatest mistakes you could make about Abraham Lincoln. One of the lawyers who practiced law with him out on the old Eighth Judicial Circuit in Illinois in the years before the Civil War, a man named Leonard Swett, said that anybody who took Abraham Lincoln for a simple-minded man would soon wake up with his back in a ditch. Larry, there were a lot of people in that ditch. When you met Abraham Lincoln, first off, the impression you would take away was captured by someone who in fact had just exactly that kind of meeting. And this man said that the impression Lincoln gave you was of a rough, intelligent farmer. And he had this very thick border state accent. And, oh, Larry, he looked funny. I'm sorry, he looked homely. I mean, just no two ways about it. People would underestimate him on that basis, and he let them. He had thought his way around all of them. Despite the fact that his education was as limited as it was, here was someone who had read voraciously, who scooped things up. Contemporary literature, contemporary philosophy, especially political economy. That was his strong center.
Define that term for us. What is political economy? There's a chapter in your book about it.
It's how you understand the integration of politics and economics. Today, we tend to regard these as two separate disciplinary spheres. That wasn't how people thought about it in the 19th century. You understood that economic decisions were made for political reasons and had political ramifications, but you also understood that politics had certain economic results that you had to reckon with. So when you did politics, you were also doing economics. When you had economics to do, you were also going to be thinking about the political possibilities and the political measures that would make them possible. So the two work together in Lincoln's mind. And he has read some of the most important pieces that are written in English in the 19th century on the subject of political economy. He's read John Stuart Mill. He has read Francis Wayland. He has read Henry Carey. These are works with which Lincoln is familiar enough that he can pick up chunks of them and quote them in speeches he gives. So anyone who thought that because this was a man who had never done anything in the way of education beyond grade school, if you thought that this was just, as Swett said, a simple-minded man, you were going to get a really big surprise when he started talking. He was very well read, and he took seriously what he read.
So because there's a chapter in your book about political economy, and because we're going to go toward the place where people accuse Lincoln of expanding the federal government beyond all recognition, maybe a good intro to that would be describe his political economy. What did he mean by that?
Well, let's put it down with a political tag. He was a Whig of the old Whig Party, which is to say that he was a follower of the famous Henry Clay and of Henry Clay's American system. You might actually say, in the longest sense of the word, that beyond Clay, Lincoln was a kind of Hamiltonian. We'll take it back to Alexander Hamilton at the very beginning of the Republic. And what the Hamiltonian, Henry Clay, Whig way of thinking about political economy was really centered around three things. One is the importance of tariffs, protection of American industry. Understand that in the America of Lincoln's day, we're not talking about a mighty industrial nation. We're talking about a nation which is still very much an agricultural nation. Some 72 out of the 119 districts represented in the northern states in the United States Congress are rural districts. This is still very much an agricultural nation. How does a nation like that get itself to an economic point where it can compete with other more vastly industrialized nations? Well, you do that through protection of American industry, and the protection comes through tariffs. So that's one point. Second point is about a national banking system. How are you going to promote interchange and commerce? Well, you have to have a common circulating medium. You have to have some kind of exchange, some form of exchange that everybody across the country understands, recognizes, and can use with confidence. Because if what you're dealing with in Louisiana is a customer who comes and wants to buy goods or services with banknotes from a bank in Maine, are you going to trust that bank that you've probably never heard of? Are those banknotes still good? No. What you need is a common national circulating medium. That is only going to come through some kind of national banking system. This is what Hamilton had in view with his Bank of the United States. It's what Henry Clay has in view, advocating this. And in fact, we'll get something reasonably close to that with the National Banking Act that Lincoln signs during the Civil War. So, tariffs, then banking, and thirdly, infrastructure. Because how do you get goods from one place to a market in another place? You've got to have roads, canals, and ultimately railroads that'll help to bring people who have goods they want to bring to market to get to those markets. You need those three things. What's the common denominator of the three? The common denominator of the three is transformation. It's enablement. And when Lincoln thought about the politics of an economy, which is to say, what's the interface between the government, in this case the federal government, and the economy, for him, that was all about how you enabled people, how you enabled commerce, how you enabled marketplaces. Because when you did that, that had another political consequence. The political consequence was self-transformation. You could take an ordinary person, as ordinary as Abraham Lincoln was when he was growing up, and you can open up before that individual all kinds of possibilities all across the country in which everyone can compete equally. If what we're talking about in the American Republic is a very democratic way of being a republic, almost to the point where you use the terms democracy and republic interchangeably, as Lincoln did, then what you're saying is we should be responsible as a nation for fostering an economy in which a poor boy born in Kentucky and raised in Indiana and who comes to maturity in Illinois can actually aspire to become a very well-known and successful prosecuting attorney and commercial attorney, and who knows, maybe even President of the United States. That kind of mobility, that kind of transformation requires that kind of economy. That kind of economy requires that kind of politics. For Lincoln, it all works together. That was his notion of political economy.
So Lincoln had some human type that he thought America could and should produce. Would you describe that? Do you agree with that? And would you describe it?
He said it over and over again. He said, in the United States, the most remarkable thing about American life is that someone can start out poor. Then they can go to work for someone else. They can work, they can save up. And when they've saved up, then they can go work for themselves, set up their own business. And then if they're successful in that business, then they can turn around and employ some other poor beginner. And thus, he said, the process can keep on going and going and going, and may it go on, he said, forever. Because that is how, in a system of political equals, people are able to prosper, and we see the result of human flourishing.
And so he one of the arguments you make here, one of the things you explain is that Lincoln thought property was important to people.
Yes. And because what do you want to do? You want to acquire property. Property is a good thing. He said, we don't envision any war between labor and capital. The acquisition of property is a good thing because then owning that property, you can turn that property to productive uses. Those productive uses benefit the people who will buy the goods or the services that your property enables you to produce, and it will also enable you to hire other beginners and give them a start in life as well. So
Lincoln was for equality, but he was not a socialist.
No. He had no interest whatsoever in moving in the kind of directions that you see in the European socialism of the day, in Proudhon or Saint-Simon, or even for that matter, Marx and Engels.
That's right. They're contemporaries, aren't they? And so he imagines an open, that's a big phrase now, right? George Soros is a student of Karl Popper, the open society. And what Lincoln meant by that was open to the energy and effort of everyone, and yet they make their own way.
For him, the key word is always going to be self-transformation. How can you take the work that you do and use it to make yourself into something which is more useful, more productive, more satisfying? A society which will foster that kind of development, which won't put somebody into a cubicle and leave them there, which won't put them into a slot and condemn them to always be in that slot. That kind of stasis for him was what described slavery. This is why he was such an enemy of slavery, because at its very bottom, a slave cannot transform himself. A slave is condemned always to be a slave, always to be a product of the master's whim. There's never any real hope for the slave. Slavery for him, then, was overwhelmingly a question of economics. And the kind of slavery that he saw in the American South was particularly offensive precisely because it stood in the way of that kind of self-transformation that he saw promised in the Declaration of Independence's declaration that all men are created equal. If we are all created equal, then we should have the freedom and the opportunity, we should have the level playing field, as it were, to move ahead and make of ourselves what we can and what we will. But a slave cannot have that. A slave, you might say, and this is what the apologists for slavery would say, slavery, well, this is a good thing because you provide the slave with all the things the slave really needs. A roof over the head, 3 square meals a day, all of that is taken care of. Pro-slavery apologists like George Fitzhugh said, well, this is what makes slavery superior to capitalism. Because in a capitalist system, well, anything can happen and nobody's responsible for anybody else. Oh, rather, said Fitzhugh, slavery is, in fact, I'm citing Fitzhugh directly here, slavery is the best form of socialism because it captures exactly that sense of stasis, that lack of movement, which they translated into security. And Lincoln thought that was abhorrent. He said, I have always hated slavery. I cannot remember a time when I did not so think and feel. And what he's saying here is slavery demeans human beings because slavery puts them in a pigeonhole and says, there you are, you're not going anywhere else, learn to enjoy your pigeonhole. For him, that was abhorrent.
So Lincoln imagined a energetic society in which people would transform, have a chance to transform themselves. And of course, that means change the form of oneself. And form is a big word. Human beings have a form, bipeds, upright, eyes, dominant sense because it's not right next to the ground, nose, deteriorated sense of smell, depreciated because it is far from the ground, and a rational soul. Mm-hmm. And so in this, don't we all want to take care of ourselves, and we all want to have independence and enough property so we don't have to worry about being hungry tomorrow and to take care of our loved ones. Is there, in Lincoln's mind, some end for human beings, some ultimate stasis that is the final goal of life? What did he say? What did he say about that?
No, he doesn't actually have in view a moment in which people say, we have arrived. We have achieved everything that human beings can achieve, and we don't need to think about doing anything more than that or going any further. At the end of a great speech that he gave in 1859, he talked about He talked about an Eastern monarch, as he put it. An Eastern monarch who said to his wise men, I want you to develop for me a statement which will always be true everywhere and at all times. And Lincoln said, the wise men of this monarch went off and talked among themselves, and they came back with a proposition. And the proposition was this: here is the statement which is going to always be true all times and in all places. And that statement ran like this: and this too shall pass. And Lincoln said, no, that in seasons of adversity, that can be a very consoling thing to say. But let us hope that it is not entirely true. Let us hope that making the best use we can of the resources of human nature and of physical nature, we can go on and on into the future, a future of constant improvement. And with Lincoln, you have that sense of an almost cosmic optimism of where people can go. And he is willing to see that happen. There may be mistakes along the road. There may be bumps on the highway. But he would prefer to let people discover for themselves what it is they are able to do without hindrance, without molestation or control by others. This is a man who is really passionately interested in freedom.
Wouldn't you say that Lincoln had a profound interest in the eternal?
Yes, he did, but he was very chary about talking too much about it. He had grown up in a very religious household, like many adolescents that you and I have known over the years. They get into adolescence, and of course they want to do the exact opposite of whatever their parents are doing, and so does Lincoln. So he comes into his young adulthood in the 20s as what people sometimes called an infidel, an unbeliever, a person who didn't have any connection to formal religion. He knows a lot about Christianity. He knows a lot about the Bible. He can recite chunks of it off by heart. But he doesn't join a church. In fact, never joins a church. We have no record that he ever participated in any kind of official church ceremony, baptism, communion, things like that. And yet, this is also a person who is always thinking about these questions. Sometimes very early on, he's thinking about religious questions in a way so as not to generate public criticism and hostile reactions, because that's going to have a political downside for him. So he wants to try to assure people, all right, it's true that I don't have any particular church membership. Nevertheless, here are the things I believe, and you could find that these are not necessarily hostile to religion. He goes further on into his 40s and early 50s. And then he has to think more seriously because he has a child who dies. His father dies. He has to take more seriously these questions of eternity. And yet he still is not going to join a church. He's not going to make any kind of official religious profession. Then we come to the Civil War years. Then he has to really think through, why is this Civil War happening? What purpose is it serving? If you believe, as Lincoln believed, in this confidence, in this constant future up movement of human aspiration, how can this Civil War, waged on behalf of a retrograde system, slavery, how can this be happening? And he wrestles with this. He tries to figure out in the most logical fashion, why has God brought this war into the life of the nation? And you see him develop over the years of his presidency, thinking more and more and increasingly more and more about religious questions, until in the second inaugural address he delivers in March of 1865, you have a man who stands, yes, as president, as a politician, speaking to the American public, but who will speak to them in terms that sounds nothing so much as like a sermon, when he talks about the will of God, the judgment of God, and being under that judgment and therefore needing to exercise necessarily malice toward none, charity towards all. watching Lincoln develop this way is an interesting spectacle in its own right. And Lincoln was conscious of his own movement. One political operative, Thurlow Weed, wrote to him after the second inaugural to compliment him. Lincoln wrote back and said, "Thank you, everyone likes a compliment." He said, "People will not be flattered that I have said that both North and South bear responsibility for this war, but that they have to accept that responsibility because God is the judge of both, and God has brought this war as a judgment on both North and South, and we have to accept it and acknowledge it for that." He said, "People will not enjoy my having said this, but," he said, "that is the only conclusion that believers in a living God can come to. And it was important for me to say that."
So I was thinking when you were talking about Lincoln, who believed in human transformation, I was thinking of my favorite phrase in the second inaugural: "If every drop of blood drawn by the lash must now be repaid by another drawn from the sword, still it will be said that the ways of God are righteous altogether."
Yes.
That is a profound judgment. But the Declaration of Independence, which Lincoln knew extremely well a long time before that, begins with this reference to the laws of nature and of nature's God.
Mm-hmm.
And in those who signed that document, and Thomas Jefferson who wrote it, they imagine a universe in which God is sitting in judgment equally upon them and upon the king. In other words, there's something beyond us.
Mm-hmm.
We can grow, we can settle a continent, we can become more prosperous, we can enjoy a wider equality of activity. We have an equality of rights in that document. But in the end, the final judgment will be something eternal in light of which we have to live. Are you saying that Lincoln learned that because of the Civil War and didn't know it before?
He had glimmerings. He had to have had glimmerings because the very Calvinistic faith in which his parents reared him would have told him that whatever happens in this world happens as a result of God's providence and God's direction. So he has, through even the earliest stages of his life, a very, very clear and palpable sense of the directing power of God in human affairs. The question is, how directing, how powerful, how intrusive? How do you understand God? In a very real sense, his ancestral Calvinism hobbled him somewhat, because if you understand that God decrees all events, whatever comes to pass, then your decision to embrace God also is part of God's decree, and you can't get ahead of that. You've got to wait for God to move you toward God. And in a sense, that slowed down Lincoln's reactions. It slowed down Lincoln's way of thinking. But the war accelerates that. The war does not give him a chance to simply look at the war and say, well, this is simply a matter of force, this is simply a matter of power, this is simply a matter of the application of politics. No, for him, the Civil War has this enormous moral dimension. It's moving towards a moral goal. What could that goal possibly be? He writes a very interesting memorandum in possibly, we think, 1862, because there's no date on it, but it sounds like 1862. And in it, he tries to work out, what is the purpose of God in this war? It almost reads like a problem in geometry as he walks through it. And what he is trying to do is to establish, what is the purpose of God here? All right, if the purpose of God was for the North to win the war, he could have done that in the first few months of the war. If the purpose of God was for the Confederacy to win the war, well, he could have done that very easily too in the first few months. Why is the war going on the way it is? And the conclusion he eventually comes to is, God has a purpose in this war, different from what either North or South began the war with. We have to see what that purpose is. Now, I think very plainly, what he's working towards is emancipation. the end of slavery. Yet at the same time, watch how he's doing this. He's not talking about God as he had talked about God 10 years before, as a very remote God, a deity somewhere in the universe. No, now he's talking about a God who is actually involved in the process of human affairs. And that particular sense, that particular notion, that concept of God is what the war helps to trigger in him, because he has no other explanation for the costs of the war than to say God has a personal involvement in what is happening in human affairs.
Was it in 1863 that, I think it was, that Lincoln had some free Negro leaders in the White House and talked to them about colonization?
August of 1862.
And they didn't like it.
No.
What did Lincoln conclude from that?
This is one of those unusual moments when you're not sure. If you're listening to Lincoln, the 19th century white supremacist, or whether you are listening to the Lincoln who is one unusually shrewd politician. Colonization was supposed to be one of those solutions to the problem of slavery that white supremacists in America were supposed to love. Because what it would say would be, all right, we will move towards emancipation, but once we move towards emancipating the slaves, we will take all those slaves and we will deport them somewhere. Because we want it to be understood that the United States is for white people. So we'll solve the slave problem, yes, by emancipating, but then we will take those whom we've emancipated, and basically we will punish them. We will punish them for having been born in America, because we're going to deny that their being born in America means anything, and we're going to ship them somewhere else. People looked at colonization, and they could draw one of two conclusions to it. If you were someone who was really committed to the abolition of slavery, and especially if you were a black American, you would look at colonization and say, thanks for nothing. Some of us have family that have gone back generations long before the white people who are constructing schemes of colonization before they were ever here. Why should we leave? Why don't you go back to Ireland or Germany or Scandinavia or wherever? Because we've been here for longer than you have. And the reaction would be, this is ridiculous. This could only come from just someone who's peddling more white supremacist ideas. All right, that's one way. One way. Now, here's the other way. How do you get a culture which is top-heavy with notions about white supremacy to agree to emancipation in the first place? Here is where the politician, as Lincoln, comes to play. How is he going to get Northern whites to sign on to the idea of emancipation? Remember, we go into this Civil War and people are swearing up and down, we are fighting the Confederacy for the purpose of restoring the Union. Not really involving ourselves in this question of slavery and race, because we don't want to think about black people. We don't want black people coming away from the South up into the North and competing for Northern jobs. All right, how do you persuade Northerners who have that view to endorse emancipation? You do it by saying, all right, let's sugarcoat emancipation. We'll talk about colonization. If we talk about colonization, will you agree to emancipation? And the testimony of a lot of Northerners was, well, all right, okay. So what does Lincoln do? He invites a delegation of black leaders to the White House. He also invites the press. What are they doing there? They're there to write this up in the newspapers. Lincoln is sending a message. We will talk about emancipation, but we'll sugarcoat it. And that's the message, I think at least, that Lincoln is trying to communicate.
I remember, I think, the notes from that, or the newspaper accounts of that, and he puts it in, he says, everywhere you go in the Union, the ban is still upon you.
Yeah.
And wonder if you want to go. There's a place. You'd have to want to go, he says.
Oh, yes.
He's not
doing compulsory. This is not going to be deportation. It's going to be a volunteer basis.
Yeah. And I don't know why you would want to live around us, he says. And then he says, think about it, right? And they come back and say, no, don't want to go.
Right. That statement of Lincoln's may be the most revealing one of all, when he says, you don't have a whole lot of motivation to live around us. He said, our race has not given you many reasons to love us. And as soon as he said that, I mean, you can hear a lot of people clutching their chests and falling over. But he's doing. Why is he pursuing this colonization thing? I think in large measure, it's because he wants to put a billboard up. We want to go to emancipation, and if this will still the opposition, all right, then we'll talk about colonization. Now, understand something. This is August of 1862. He has the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation sitting in his desk. He's already read it to his cabinet. He knows where he wants to go with this. What he is doing, he's doing some public relations here. At least this is the interpretation as I'm reading it, but it's also the interpretation that a number of other people saw in it. One foreign observer, Frederick Milne's Edge, and a very famous black pastor, Henry McNeil Turner, in Washington, D.C., saying, look, understand what Lincoln is getting at. Lincoln is trying to damp down the opposition to emancipation.
Mm. And if Lincoln has, as I read it, two problems to face. One is it's a lesson that we are learning to our cost in attempting to found democracies around the world. Democracy is not something you can do for somebody else. He says, you'll know exactly the quote, I bet you, Alan. He says, a near universal opinion cannot be safely ignored. So white people look down on black people in substantial numbers, and yet they're a majority of the voters. And if we make them, are they sovereign anymore? That's the first problem. And the second problem is the Constitution did not give the federal government, until amendment, power to interfere with slavery in the states where it existed. And he regarded the Constitution as precious, right? Yes. Apples of gold and pictures of silver.
Exactly.
How did he address that? Explain that.
There were several ways of going at the problem of slavery. And he took his election as a sign that the country had decided to take the first public step in opposition to slavery. All right, what is that first step? The first step is you make it clear that slavery is not going to be legalized anywhere apart from the states where it is currently legal. You're not going to allow slavery to spread into the Western territories. You're not going to let slavery turn those territories and the states that are formed out of those territories into some kind of leverage for slavery to nationalize it across the country. All right, step one, no expansion of slavery into the territories. Second thing, buy it out. And one of the things that people do not, I think, pay sufficient attention to is how, within 6 months of his inauguration, he begins devising schemes for buying out slavery. And he does this, you might say, the laboratory for it. There are 4 states where slavery is legalized in the United States in 1861. That's Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, the so-called border states. There, slavery is legal, but they haven't joined the Confederacy. They're still part of the Union. Lincoln wants to make an overture to the state of Delaware. Delaware is a slave state, only has 1,700 slaves, but it's a slave state. He wants to make an overture to their state legislature to say, we will provide you with $700,000 in United States bonds. You may then turn around, sell those bonds, use the proceeds to buy the freedom of every slave in Delaware. That's what the state legislature will do. If that works, we move to Maryland, do the same thing. If that works, we move to Kentucky, do likewise, and thence to Missouri. What he wants to do is to start buying slavery out. Now, that's an expensive proposition. Not, as he pointed out, nearly as expensive as civil war. So, use the authority, use the means, use the resources of the federal government to make overtures to these states and offer to buy them out. And he believes, at least in 1861, that really is going to be the strategy that works. There was only one problem. The Delaware state legislature threw it right back in his face. They loved white supremacy more than they loved freedom, so they refused to go along. Well, that leads him to begin to explore other possibilities. And the second possibility, and actually the one he will act upon, is going to be to read the Constitution carefully and to see that in the Constitution, as president, he has the authority to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy in time of war or rebellion. All right, if he's going to be the commander-in-chief, there should be some powers that go along with that, the war powers. What's the point of being a commander-in-chief if there are not any war powers? Among those war powers, deal with the enemy who is making war. How do you incapacitate an enemy who is making war? You emancipate that enemy's slaves. So, the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. But the ultimate solution? You amend the Constitution. And he goes through a long process of persuasion to get Congress, and he finally does get Congress, to pass a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery in January of 1865. But in the process, and this is the most interesting thing about the entire movement of Lincoln in this direction, is how carefully constitutional he was in all of this. In September of 1863, September 2nd, 1863, his Secretary of the Treasury, Selman Chase, an abolitionist from Ohio, writes to Lincoln and says, well, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation has been doing very well. It's had great effect. Why don't we just move ahead, take those 4 border states, and declare emancipation there as well, instead of just in the Confederacy? Lincoln writes back to him and says, I can't do that. I can't just issue unilateral declarations, even if they respect my particular personal opinion. I can't act just on that. If I acted outside the Constitution, wouldn't I be doing the same thing that these rebels against the Constitution are doing? Would I not be, there's a great phrase he uses, would I not be in the boundless field of absolutism? He won't go there.
In other words,
he will emancipate, but it's going to be constitutional.
On that point, doesn't Lincoln, the restraint he shows in the face of the Constitution, I take some pride in the fact that the founders of the college where I work had to do with that device of forbidding slavery in the federal territories and foregoing getting rid of it in the states. But if you do break the Constitution, then you are acting rather like the slaveholders themselves.
Exactly. I mean, he said to Chase, this would make us guilty of exactly the thing we're accusing the rebels in the Confederacy of doing. And that, in fact, that's not the only issue in which he will raise that point. In 1864, he's up for re-election. All right, Civil War is going on. In fact, in the summer of 1864, it's not doing particularly well. I don't think at that point that if Lincoln had said, look, you know, it's kind of a silly idea to be holding a national election in the middle of a civil war, could anyone really have raised an objection? Well, they could have raised an objection, but wouldn't it at least have been understandable to say, in the middle of a national emergency, we're going to have to cancel or delay these elections? He doesn't do that. He is convinced by the end of August 1864, he's going to lose. And yet the thought never seems even to have crossed his mind. Now, he does go on to get reelected in November. The situation, militarily and politically, turns around. And after the election, a group of jubilant Washingtonians comes to serenade him at the White House. And he gives a little speech to them. And he says, we had to have these elections. We couldn't cancel these elections. You have to have free elections in a democracy, because if we didn't, it would be the same thing as giving away everything that we had been fighting for to the rebels in the Confederacy. So he is constantly keeping in view, what is it we are fighting for? Yes, it's for the abolition of slavery. Yes, it's for the restoration of the Union. But in the most ultimate sense, what he wants to see triumph, the thing which, above all, he sees is at stake in the Civil War. is this whole question of whether democracies can survive or whether under pressure, under stress, they simply fly off into pieces and thereby justify all the skepticism of monarchs and dictators about democracies.
That's beautiful, Alan. Could Reconstruction have gone better?
I don't see how it could have gone worse. When you consider Andrew Johnson as a successor to Abraham Lincoln, the palm flies to the forehead, and you think, "Oh my goodness, how could this happen?" I'm always leery of what if speculations. History people have enough trouble trying to establish what actually happened without often wandering off to guess about what might have happened. But I have to say that I'm asked this question more often than any other question in places that I go and talk about Lincoln, and that is, what if Lincoln had lived? So in the book, in Our Ancient Faith, at the very end, I give myself permission. I probably don't deserve it, but I gave myself permission to ask the question, what if Lincoln had lived? And I think there are some indicators. I think he would certainly have been strongly supportive of black civil rights. He was already talking about that before his assassination. I think he would probably also have wanted to talk about black economic empowerment, because if his whole political career had been dedicated to the idea of self-transformation, then certainly self-transformation is what would be important to these newly freed slaves and would certainly go hand in hand with the civil freedoms they were now about to enjoy. I think also that you would probably have looked for a longer Reconstruction than the one we actually got. I think we might have looked for something much more similar to what we did after the Second World War, long-term with Germany and with Japan. We stayed the course there, and the results are very clear and very manifest. But I also have to say this. Reconstruction might have been a problem that even the political talents of Abraham Lincoln might not have been quite equal to. That's not because I know something about Lincoln that others don't. It's that I know a few things about the problems of Reconstruction, and they were formidable, so formidable that they might have stymied even an Abraham Lincoln. So I always keep that reservation in view. Even Lincoln might have found Reconstruction to be a very, very difficult nut to crack.
Lincoln had a wonderful power to explain, and my own view is that might have helped a lot. There's a debate with Douglas where Douglas, in the Lincoln-Douglas speech, where Douglas comments on the fact that Lincoln's friend Frederick Douglass, the speaker at the Hillsdale College twice, rode through this town in a carriage driven by a white man. You want to see things like that? Vote for Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln's response is, in her right, he says, to eat the bread that she earns with the sweat of her own face. The black woman is the equal of everyone here. And that's a powerful argument.
Well, it certainly is. I mean, especially when you see it in the way that Lincoln defines the way he's talking about rights. He will be dealing with Stephen A. Douglas, who is a shameless player of the race card in front of white Illinoisans. And Lincoln accommodates himself to a certain extent to that when he gets up and says, as he does in the fourth of the debates in 1858 at Charleston, Illinois, when he says, I've no interest in trying to promote the social or political equality of the races. And people have sometimes latched on to that statement of Lincoln's and said, see, he really isn't interested in equality. This is all just a lot of flim-flam talk. Well, read on a little bit. Social and political equality, he says, no. Natural equality, equality of natural rights, the right of that person to eat the fruit of their labor that they've earned by the sweat of their brow. In that respect, yes, the equal of myself, Judge Douglas, and every other living man. What does that stimulate in Douglas? It stimulates a response that says, if you take Lincoln's logic, despite what he has said previously about social and political equality, if you take Lincoln's logic about natural equality, the equality of natural rights, if you take that seriously, you're going to get political and social equality. So if you want black citizenship, vote for Lincoln. For once in his life, Stephen A. Douglas had it absolutely right. He had seen exactly where the logic of Lincoln's position was going to go. That was the really determining factor, and in fact, the great line that exists between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas.
Amen. And that's beautiful, Alan. And I think that's the time we have. And I mentioned the name of the book again, Ancient Faith. And our listeners could do much worse anytime than read Alan Guelzo. I encourage it.